Welcome to Annette on Life, Liberty, and Happiness, a podcast where I talk about the Constitution, politics, history, and pretty much anything else I want to talk about. You can find this podcast on AnnetteTalks.com, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, etc. And if you want to see a video, go to YouTube, youtube.com/Annette Talks. You can also find me on Facebook, facebook.com/Annette Talks. And I think that covers it. Just find me. Anyway, so today is my July 4th episode. Happy Independence Day. I'm recording it a week ahead of time, but I'm posting it on July 4th. So it just seemed like a really good time to stop and take stock of where we're at and look at our past and then maybe what our future holds. So, I've always loved July 4th. It's, as you can see, I've got my Valley Forge picture behind me, if you can see video. One of my favorite portraits of George Washington. And I just always loved it. And I'm probably always going to love it, even when things feel not so great right now. So if you're listening to this far in the future, this is the July 4th, 2020 episode. And when I say 2020, you should get an idea of where I'm coming from. This has been a crazy year so far, and it's only halfway through. The thought that kept going through my mind today as I was getting ready to record was, these are the times that try men's souls. And yes, they are. I had posted on Facebook not long ago, I shared a meme of a pizza. It said, if pizza was a year, and this is what it would, if 2020 was pizza, this is what it would look like. And it had anchovies, which would be enough for me right now. Ugh, yuck. Anchovies, I think banana slices, and like an egg plopped down right in the middle, a fried egg. It was, just disgusting, nauseating. And I thought, yeah, that's about what 2020 feels like, which is ironic because when it first started, I was so excited about it. I thought, 2020, what an awesome year. Who knew? Anyway, just a sample of the things that have been happening this year. The main things were obviously COVID-19, which came around February, and then March, everything shut down, and we're still not completely opened up, and we still have people running around in masks. And I've kind of decided to lay that topic or that issue aside for a while, and I don't want to give it any more attention because I spend way too much energy on it, and it feels like a red herring. So I don't want to give that any more attention than it needs. But we are still partially shut down. The numbers are rising in some places. And so things that were open are closing again. Not here in Douglas County, Colorado, thank goodness, but in a lot of areas. So people are still freaking out about that. And of course, it's not as deadly as people thought it was going to be. But what we saw on display was governors shutting down private businesses, shutting down all large gatherings, and especially important to most of us is that they shut down the churches and the temples. And we complied. As a church, we complied, but it was ordered. It was mandated. And so we have this plague, which hasn't, it's been deadly for some people, yes, obviously, but not nearly as deadly as we thought. And but I think even worse was the everything that happened from the shutdowns, the 40 million jobs lost, and the economy tanked. They spent, I think, $6 trillion on stimulus from the Congress. just crazy stuff. Suicides went through the roof. All sorts of things that come of closing things down. People not getting to be able to go to the doctor for other things. It was like COVID-19 was everything. It was like everything else just stopped. People were having heart attacks and cancer was spreading because they couldn't get in to see their doctor. Just lots of hideous things. And then, if that wasn't enough, we had an episode where a white police officer took a black suspect down and had his knee on him and kept his knee on him despite the fact that he was saying, "I can't breathe," and everyone was saying, "You need to get your knee off of this guy," and he died. I still have not heard any proof or see any proof that this was racially motivated, but people reacted to it as if it was. So I guess you just have to have a white cop and a black suspect for it to be racially motivated. Anyway, I think part of the reason this turned into such a firestorm was people were shut down for so long and tempers flared. Anyway, that led to protests, which came with lots of looting and rioting, businesses destroyed. I think in Minneapolis alone, there was $50 million worth of damage done. And I think that's on the low end. And then it spread to other cities. Most big cities, I think, were hit with these looters and rioters who were Antifa and Black Lives Matter. And if you go back, you can see I did an episode on Antifa, and I'm going to do Black Lives Matter next week. But then, to make it even more crazy, a group of these people took over 6 blocks of downtown Seattle and called it their own. They decided it was an autonomous zone. They called it CHAZ, Capitol Hills. I think that was what it stood for, autonomous zone. And now they've changed it to CHOP, and I don't remember what that stands for. But nonetheless, they've taken over 6 blocks of Seattle, and Seattle's mayor and police have just let it happen. And it's been weeks now. It's just sitting there. So we've got all sorts of craziness going on. And they're the same people that are doing all the rioting and looting are taking down statues of anyone they don't like, and even nonsensical ones like Washington and Lincoln. Lincoln was the one that helped free the slaves, and yet these people are all being taken down because they're racist, supposedly. So everyone's a racist. It's just that some people are apologizing for it. Anyway, there's just lots and lots of craziness going on. And so I wanted to take a step back and remind people that things have been crazy in the past, and they're going to be crazy again in the future. But we still have some solid foundation to stand on. So I wanted to go back to one of my favorite prophets who's done a lot of speaking on issues that have to do with our country and our freedom. And that's Ezra Taft Benson. And I got his book here, This Nation Shall Endure. And I wanted to read a section from it on the signers of the Declaration so that we can honor the signers today, and also to remember that this is where we started and that we have not departed from this yet. Anyway, I'm going to read this section on the signers, and then I'm going to transition over to the Constitution. All right, so as we read, and it's funny because this was written, I think, in 1975, and yet it still sounds true, which is why I thought it would be nice to go backwards a little bit to show you that this craziness is not just a product of the 21st century. So here I go. As we read the newspapers and other printed materials, listen to television and radio, and read or hear the voices of distinguished Americans, we become conscious that America is at the crossroads. We stand today with the reality before us that we could lose our great heritage of freedom. Wow. Doesn't that sound familiar? The only thing I would change is I would add, as we look at the internet, as we go on social media, as we watch YouTube videos of people taking down statues and things like that. Anyway, going on. There are those in our midst who depreciate our great beloved republic and the men who laid the foundation of our government. These are the voices and the words that our youth frequently hear or read. I ask, how can they be expected to feel a duty to God and their country when the climate of opinion is so negative to all that we cherish and hold dear? That just rings so true right now when I see people tearing down Washington and Lincoln and defacing Brigham Young. It's really hard to watch them defacing and tearing down these people that I hold dear. The answer to that question will be decided by how well our homes instill a love of God and of our country, and how well as we as leaders exemplify before our youth our devotion. When was the last time you took the occasion to let them know your feelings about your country? And I want to say that one of the few positives that came out of the lockdown, homeschool. Homeschool was not positive, but it gave me the opportunity to insert some of my own education into my girls' daily lives. And that was that we did little Constitution tutorials. And so they're getting a better idea. They didn't know. They do now. This nation is unlike any other nation. It was uniquely born. It had its beginning when 56 men affixed their signatures to the Declaration of Independence. I realize there are some who view that declaration as only a political document. It is much more than that. It constitutes a spiritual manifesto declaring, not for this nation alone, but for all nations, the source of man's rights. The purpose of the Declaration was to set forth the moral justifications of a rebellion against a long recognized political tradition, the divine right of kings. At issue was the fundamental question of whether men's rights were God-given or whether these rights were to be dispensed by governments to their subjects. This document proclaimed that all men have certain inalienable rights. In other words, that those rights came from God. The colonists were therefore not rebels against political authority. Their contention was not with Parliament nor the British people. It was against a tyrannical monarch who had conspired, incited, and plundered them. They were thus morally justified to revolt. As it was stated in the Declaration, when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. These things, this really makes me think about how shut down we were and how that was a real overreach. The document concludes with this pledge: for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. How prophetic that pledge was to be. Consider with me some of the sacrifices made by these signers. And I think it's important that we remember the sacrifices, because we are being called on, or will be called on, to make sacrifices. And we need to know that our sacrifices will probably not even compare to what these founders went through. 56 men signed the document on August 2nd, 1776, or in the case of some, shortly thereafter. They came from all walks of life. 23 were lawyers, 12 were merchants, 12 were men of the soil, 4 were physicians, 2 were manufacturers, 1 was a politician, 1 a printer, and another a minister. Almost a third of the signers were under 40 years of age. 18 were in their 30s and 3 were in their 20s. Only 7 were over 60. The youngest, Edward Rutledge of South Carolina, was 26 and a half, and the oldest, Benjamin Franklin, was 70. 3 of the signers lived to be over 90. Charles Carroll died at age 94. 10 died in their 80s. Possibly as many as 6 of the signers were childless in their marriages. 2 never did marry, but the remainder sired 325 children. Carter Braxton had 18 children. William Ellery, 17, and Robert Sherman, 15. I had no idea about that. The signers were religious men, all being Protestant except Charles Carroll, who was Roman Catholic. Over half expressed their religious faith as being Episcopalian. Others were Congregational, Presbyterian, Quaker, and Baptist. 2 of the signers would become presidents of the United States: Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration, and John Adams. 2, John Adams and Benjamin Harrison, would be fathers of future presidents. Another, Elbridge Gerry, was the vice president under James Madison. Those signers pledged their lives, and some paid the price for the nation's birth and our birthright. At least 9 of them died as a result of the war or its hardships on them. The first of the signers to die was John Morton of Pennsylvania. He was at first sympathetic to the British, but finally changed his mind and cast his vote for independence. By the way, did you know only something like a third of the colonists were in favor of independence? Anyway, by doing so, his friends, relatives, and neighbors turned against him. Those who knew him best said this ostracism hastened his death, for he lived only 8 months after the signing. His last words were, "Tell them that they will live to see the hour when they shall acknowledge it to have been the most glorious service that I ever rendered to my country." Another to pay with his life was Caesar Rodney. Suffering facial cancer, he left his sickbed at midnight and rode all night by horseback through a severe storm. He arrived just in time to cast a deciding vote for his delegation in favor of independence. His doctors told him he needed treatment obtainable only in Europe. He refused to go in this time of his country's crisis. The decision cost him his life. When the British came to Trenton, they settled near the home of John Hart, one of the 5 signers from New Jersey. He had a large farm and several grist mills. While his wife was on her deathbed, Hessian soldiers descended on Hart's property. They destroyed his mills, ravaged his property, and scattered his 13 children. Hart became a hunted fugitive. When he finally returned to his land, he was broken in health. His farmland was scourged, his wife had died, and his children were all scattered. He died 3 years after signing the Declaration. Yet the signers also pledged their fortunes, and at least 15 saw the realization of that pledge. 12 had their homes ransacked or ruined. 6 literally gave their fortunes to further the cause. When the 4 New York delegates signed the Declaration, they signed away their property. William Floyd was exiled from his home for 7 years and was practically ruined financially. Francis Lewis had his home plundered and burned, and his wife was carried away prisoner. She suffered great brutality and never regained her health. She died within 2 years. He never regained his fortune. Robert Morris had his property destroyed and, like Floyd, was denied his home for 7 years. Philip Livingston never saw his home again, for his estate became a British naval hospital. He sold all of his remaining property to finance the revolution. He died before the war was over. Another signer, Merchant Robert Morris, sold 150 ships, which were sunk during the war. 3 of the 4 signers from South Carolina, Thomas Hayward, Arthur Middleton, and Edward Rutledge, were taken prisoner by the British and imprisoned for 10 months. Thomas Nelson, Jr. of Virginia, died in poverty at age 51. He gave his fortune to help finance the war and never regained either it or his health. Before Patrick Henry gave his great speech, he was preceded by Nelson, who said, "I am a merchant of Yorktown, but I am a Virginian first. Let my trade perish. I call God to witness that if any British troops are landed in the county of Yorks, of which I am a lieutenant, I will wait no order, but will summon the militia and drive the invaders into the sea." When Patrick Henry declared his immortal words, "Give me liberty or give me death," he was not speaking idly. When those signers affixed their signatures to that sacred document, they were, in a real sense, choosing liberty or death. For if the revolution failed, if their fight had come to naught, they would be hanged as traitors. Yet the signers fulfilled their pledge. Their spirit of sacrifice was exemplified by John Adams, who, when others were vacillating on whether to adopt the Declaration, declared, "Sink or swim, live or die, survive or perish, I give my hand and my heart to this vote. It is true indeed that in the beginning we aimed not at independence, but there's a divinity which shapes our ends. Why then should we defer the Declaration? You and I, indeed, may rue it. We may not live to the time when this Declaration shall be made good. We may die colonists, die slaves. Die, it may be, ignominiously and on the scaffold. Be it so, be it so. If it be the pleasure of heaven that my country shall require the poor offering of my life, the victim shall be ready. But while I do live, let me have a country, or at least the hope of a country, and that a free country. But whatever may be our fate, be assured that this Declaration will stand. It may cost treasure and it may cost blood, but it will stand, and it will richly compensate for both. Through the thick gloom of the present, I see the brightness of the future as the sun in heaven. We shall make this a glorious and immortal day. When we are in our graves, make this a glorious and an immortal day. When we are in our graves, our children will honor it. They will celebrate it with thanksgiving, with festivity, with bonfires and illuminations. On its annual return, they will shed tears, copious, gushing tears, not of subjection and slavery, not of agony and distress, but of exultation, of gratitude, and of joy. Sir, before God, I believe the hour is come. My judgment approves this measure, and my whole heart is in it. All that I have, and all that I am, and all that I hope in this life, I am now ready here to stake upon it, and I leave off as I begun. That live or die, survive or perish, I am for the Declaration. It is my living sentiment, and by the blessing of God, it shall be my dying sentiment. Independence now and independence forever." That's amazing, by John Adams. How fitting it is that we sing in America the Beautiful, "O beautiful for heroes proved in liberating strife, who more than self their country loved, and mercy more than life." These patrons were willing to make the effort and sacrifice they did because they understood a fundamental that seems to be forgotten today, that the rights of man are either God-given as part of a divine plan, or they are granted as part of a political plan. Reason, necessity, and religious conviction and belief in the sovereignty of God led these men to accept the divine origin of man's rights. To God's glory and the credit of these men, our nation had its unique birth. If we accept the premise that human rights are granted by government, then we must be willing to accept the corollary that they can be denied by government. If Americans should ever come to believe that their rights and freedoms are instituted among men by politicians and bureaucrats, then they will no longer carry the proud inheritance of their forefathers, but will grovel before their masters seeking favors and dispensations, a throwback to the feudal system of the Dark Ages. We must ever keep in mind the inspired words of Thomas Jefferson as found in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Since God created man with certain unalienable rights, and man in turn created government to help secure and safeguard those rights, it follows that man is superior to government and should remain master over it, not the other way around. As said so appropriately by Lord Acton, it was from America that the plain ideas that men ought to mind their own business, and that the nation is responsible to heaven for the acts of the state. Ideas long locked in the breasts of solitary thinkers and hidden among Latin folios burst forth like a conqueror upon the world they were destined to transform, under the title of the rights of man. And that principle gained ground that a nation can never abandon its fate to an authority it cannot control. We also need to keep before us the truth that people who do not master themselves and their appetites will soon be mastered by government. And I would add, and the mob. I wonder if we are not rearing a generation that seemingly does not understand this fundamental principle. Yet this is the principle that separates our country from all others. The central issue before the people today is the same issue that inflamed the hearts of our founding fathers in 1776 to strike out for independence. That issue is whether the individual exists for the state or whether the state exists for the individual. In a republic, the real danger is that we may slowly slide into a condition of slavery of the individual to the state, rather than entering this condition by a sudden revolution. The loss of our liberties might easily come about, not through the ballot box, but through the abandonment of the fundamental teachings from God and this basic principle upon which our free country was founded. Such a condition is usually brought about by a series of little steps, which at the time seems justified by a variety of reasons. Yes, I thank God for the sacrifices and efforts made by our founding fathers, whose efforts brought us the blessings we have today. Their lives should be reminders to us that we are blessed beneficiaries of a liberty earned by great sacrifice of property, reputation, and life. There should be no doubt what our task is today. If we truly cherish the freedoms we have, we must instill these sacred principles in the hearts and minds of our youths. We have the obligation to rekindle the flame that existed 200 years ago among those who pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. The opportunity for patriots to do so is clearly upon us. So it's amazing to me that that's just as applicable today, if not more so, than it was when it was written. And one of the reasons why when I see these statues being torn down, it just kills me. These are our forefathers. These people, I think, are doing it mostly out of ignorance. They do not understand what they're doing. They do not understand what these men and their wives gave us. Oh, I don't know if you know it either, but a little known fact about the Declaration is that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on the same day, July 4th, 1826. 50 years to the day of the Declaration's signing. There's no way that was a coincidence. I've actually been to John Adams' home in Quincy, Massachusetts. Yes, they pronounce it Quincy there. And got to go in there and see the chair that he was sitting in when he died. And he was looking out the window and thinking about his friend, Thomas Jefferson. Anyway, so that's what started this. But of course, we know that the Constitution is even more important and is the scripture that gives us our freedoms today. And so I wanted to share with you a part of this another talk by Ezra Taft Benson. Again, he's He's the prophet that spoke most about our freedoms. I love this man. This is from 1987, called Our Divine Constitution. My beloved brethren and sisters, what a glorious blessing to be assembled in another great conference of the church. I ask for an interest in your faith and prayers as I speak to you about a subject that is very close to my heart and that affects the worldwide church. We have recently celebrated the bicentennial of the signing of the United States Constitution. That commemorated the beginning of a series of events leading up to the ratification of the Constitution, implementation of the government it created, and the writing and ratification of the Bill of Rights. We look forward to the future commemoration of each of these important events during the next 4 years. It is as a result of these events that we are able to meet today in peace as members of the restored Church of Jesus Christ. For this, we should all be eternally grateful. I desire, therefore, to speak to you about our divine constitution, which the Lord said belongs to all mankind and should be maintained for the rights and protections of all flesh according to just and holy principles. The Constitution of the United States has served as a model for many nations and is the oldest constitution in use today. I established the constitution of this land, said the Lord, by the hands of wise men whom I raised up unto this very purpose. Doctrine and Covenants 101, verse 80. For centuries, the Lord kept America hidden in the hollow of his hand until the time was right to unveil her for her destiny in the last days. It is wisdom that this land should be kept as yet from the knowledge of other nations, said Lehi. For behold, many nations would overrun the land, that there would be no place for an inheritance. 2 Nephi 1:8. In the Lord's due time, the Spirit wrought upon Columbus, the Pilgrims, the Puritans, and others to come to America. And yes, Columbus played a huge part. That's something else that's a real pet peeve, is that people are tearing down Columbus. Even members of the church do not understand the importance of Columbus. They testified of God's intervention in their behalf. The Book of Mormon records that they humbled themselves before the Lord, and the power of the Lord was with them. Our Father in heaven planned the coming forth of the founding fathers and their form of government as the necessary great prologue leading to the restoration of the gospel. Recall what our Savior Jesus Christ said nearly 2,000 years ago when he visited this promised land. For it is wisdom in the Father that they should be established in this land and be set up as a free land of liberty, was to be the Lord's latter-day base of operation for his restored church. And he goes on to talk about the Declaration. The years immediately preceding the Constitutional Convention were filled with disappointments and threats to the newly won peace. Washington was offered a kingship, which he adamantly refused. Nephi had prophesied hundreds of years before that this land shall be a land of liberty unto the Gentiles, and there shall be no kings upon the land. Between the critical years of 1783 and 1787, an outsider viewing the affairs of the United States would have thought that the 13 states, different in so many ways, could never effectively unite. The world powers were confident that this nation would not last. Eventually, 12 of the states met in Philadelphia to address the problem. Madison said at the beginning of the convention that the delegates were now digesting a plan which in its operation would decide forever the fate of the Republican government. The Lord knoweth all things from the beginning, said Nephi. Wherefore he prepared the way to accomplish all his words among the children of men. 1 Nephi 9:6. 4 months later, the convention delegates had completed their work. As Gladstone said, it was the most wonderful work ever struck off at a given time by the brain and purpose of men. The delegates were the recipients of heavenly inspiration. James Madison, often referred to as the father of the Constitution, wrote, "It is impossible for the man of pious reflection not to perceive in it a finger of that almighty hand which has been so frequently and signally extended to our relief in the critical stages of the Revolution." Alexander Hamilton, famous as the originator of the Federalist Papers and the author of 51 of the essays, said, "For my own part, I sincerely esteem it a system which without the finger of God never could have been suggested and agreed upon by such a diversity of interest." During his first inaugural address in 1789, President George Washington, a man who was raised up by God, said, "No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency." So on and on it goes, but we know that the founders all saw God's hand in the creating of the Constitution, and that they wanted their work acknowledged. President Wilford Woodruff spoke of it. Okay, I have to back up a little bit. Shortly after the President Spencer W. Kimball became president of the church, he assigned me to go into the vault of the St. George Temple and check the early records. As I did so, I realized the fulfillment of a dream I had ever since learning of the visiting of the founding fathers to the St. George Temple. I saw with my own eyes the record of the work which was done for the founding fathers of this great nation, beginning with George Washington. Think of it, the founding fathers of this nation, those great men, appeared within those sacred walls and had their vicarious work done for them. President Wilford Woodruff spoke of it in these words. Before I left St. George, the spirits of the dead gathered around me, wanting to know why we did not redeem them. Said they, you have had the use of the endowment house for a number of years, and yet nothing has ever been done for us. We laid the foundation of the government you now enjoy, and we never apostatized from it, but we remained true to it and were faithful to God. After he became president of the church, President Wilford Woodruff declared that those men who laid the foundation of this American government were the best spirits the God of heaven could find on the face of the earth. They were choice spirits and were inspired of the Lord. So the church could not be established without the founders coming and establishing freedom, which they came and did. And so then we established the church on their backs, and they came and said, are you going to use it for us now? Are you going to bless us with this? Unfortunately, we as a nation have apostatized in various degrees from different constitutional principles as proclaimed by the inspired founders. We are fast approaching that moment prophesied by Joseph Smith when he said, even this nation will be on the very verge of crumbling to pieces and tumbling to the ground. It feels like that right now, doesn't it? And when the Constitution is upon the brink of ruin, this people will be the staff upon which the nation shall lean, and they shall bear the Constitution away from the very verge of destruction. That's us. I think that's us, people. We are the ones that are going to save this Constitution. We are. So then President Benson gave 4 recommendations of what we need to be doing to be able to save the Constitution. First and foremost, we must be righteous. John Adams said, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. If the Constitution is to have continuance, this American nation, and especially the Latter-day Saints, must be virtuous. The Book of Mormon warns us relative to our living in this free land. Wherefore, this land is consecrated unto him whom he shall bring, and if it so be that they shall serve him according to the commandments which he hath given, it shall be a land of liberty unto them. Wherefore they shall never be brought down into captivity. If so, it shall be because of iniquity. For if iniquity shall abound, cursed shall be the land for their sakes. But unto the righteous it shall be blessed forever. And now, warn Moroni, we can behold the decrees of God concerning this land, that it is the land of promise, and whatsoever nation shall possess it shall serve God, or they shall be swept off when the fullness of his wrath shall come upon them, and the fullness of his wrath come upon them when they are ripened in iniquity. 2 great American Christian civilizations, the Jaredites and the Nephites, were swept off this land because they did not serve the God of the land, who is Jesus Christ. What will become of our civilization? I don't know how many of us it will take to be righteous. Maybe we can beg and say, just 10 of us, please. But those of us who know better have got to do our best. Let's have a critical mass of righteousness. I don't want to lose this country, not for something I didn't do or some way in which I failed the Lord. Second, we must learn the principles of the Constitution in the tradition of the founding fathers. Have we read the Federalist Papers? Are we reading the Constitution and pondering it? Are we aware of its principles? Are we abiding by these principles and teaching them to others? Could we defend the Constitution? Can we recognize when a law is constitutionally unsound, like I would argue all the shutdowns? Do we know what the prophets have said about the Constitution and the threats to it? As Jefferson said, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects that we what never was and never will be. And I have a goal in the coming months to start recording episodes on the Constitution. I'd like to take it a chunk at a time, probably going to talk about the separation of powers first, and then we go into the First Amendment second. I don't know exactly how I'm going to do it, but my goal is to take the Constitution chunk by chunk and present it to you in podcast episodes. Third, we must become involved in civic affairs to see that we are properly represented. The Lord said that he holds men accountable for their acts in relation to government, both in making laws and administering them. We must follow this counsel from the Lord. Honest men and wise men should be sought for diligently, and good men and wise men ye should observe to uphold. Otherwise, whatsoever is less than these cometh of evil. Note the qualities that the Lord demands of those who are to represent us. They must be good, wise, and honest. I think it'd be awfully hard to find those. Throw a stone in Congress. I don't know if you'd hit any. So that to me sounds like we should be running for office, or at least backing really great people who are running for office. And we should not be supporting people who aren't great people. And we've got to know the difference. Fourth, we must make our influence felt by our vote, our letters, our teaching, and our advice. We must become accurately informed and then let others know how we feel. Hello, Facebook? I think I do too much of this. Being accurately informed is a hard thing today, though, because we have so much fake news. We really have to look at what we're posting, check sources, read it, ponder it. I need to get better at praying before I post. The prophet Joseph Smith said, "It is our duty to concentrate all our influence to make popular that which is sound and good, and unpopular that which is unsound. 'Tis right politically for a man who has influence to use it. From henceforth I will maintain all the influence I can get." I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. It will be saved by the righteous citizens of this nation who love and cherish freedom. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church, among others, men and women who understand and abide the principles of the Constitution. I reverence the Constitution of the United States as a sacred document. To me, its words are akin to the revelations of God, for God has placed his stamp of approval upon it. I testify that the God of heaven sent some of his choicest spirits to lay the foundations of this government, and he has now sent other choice spirits to preserve it. We, the blessed beneficiaries of the Constitution, face difficult days in America, like right now, a land which is choice above all other lands. May God give us the faith and the courage exhibited by those patriots who pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. May we be equally as valiant and as free. I pray in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. That's the end of Ezra Taft Benson's talk. I recommend, if you haven't read this for a while, go back. It's called Our Divine Constitution, Ensign, November 1987. Can you imagine that as a conference talk today? Oh, boy, we need it, don't we? Speaking of which, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but for those of you who have been paying attention recently, there was recently a law school religious freedoms annual review or forum. I think this is the review is the article that came out of it. And Elder Bednar spoke about it, the COVID-19 restrictions and religious freedom. And I'm going to give you a few of the highlights. And then I have to tell you that a few weeks ago, I posted an email that I sent to our governor, and I told him that since he deemed the riots and looters or the protests as essential and didn't come down hard on trying to stop them, despite the fact that we're not supposed to have these large gatherings, I sent him an email and I said, you need to throw open the churches because you are calling on the First Amendment and saying that these protests are essential, but that our religious freedom, our right to exercise our religion is not, because you're still limiting our church worship. And by doing so, you show yourself to be a hypocrite. So I posted that on Facebook, and I had a friend challenge me in person on it. And he said, I don't agree with you. And I said, well, why not? He said, well, we can have meaningful worship at home, like we've been having meaningful worship at home. And I had been thinking about that concept myself, because yes, we have Come Follow Me manual. We've been having meaningful worship at home. Most people, not me, but most people have priesthood holders in their home that can bless the sacrament and pass it. And I've been lucky enough to have priesthood holders step up and provide me with sacrament almost every week. I think I only missed 1 week. But the question is not, was I able to go and find a meaningful way to worship? The question is, who decides what's meaningful? Who decides what's essential for my religious practice? Me or the governor? I get to choose. The church gets to choose. And if it's meaningful for us to meet and gather, then that's what we need. The governor can't say go home and be satisfied with that. He's not the arbiter of that. He doesn't make that decision. So a few weeks later, this article comes out with Elder Bednar's talk about religious freedom and how essential it is. And that same friend, bless him, tagged me on the post on Facebook. And I know what he was saying. He was saying, you're right. And so I felt justified. But of course, when you think about it, this country was established. The Declaration happened. The Constitution happened. They were inspired by a loving Heavenly Father for the very purpose of our religious freedom, so that the gospel could be established here. This did not happen anywhere else. It was established here so that the very first amendment, Amendment number 1, which is put first for a reason, would start out with very first clause of the First Amendment of our Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Our founders considered this to be the most important freedom that they needed to protect. So when you see governors or other people, health department officials saying your freedom of religion is not essential, you tell them, yes, it is. The Constitution tells us it is. And so Elder Bednar gave this whole talk. If you haven't found it, I encourage you to go find it. It's called And When He Comes to Himself. You can just Google it. You'll find it really quickly. But he goes through and he talks about how religious freedom and the right to gather with the faithful, how the right to gather is essential to our religious freedom. And the right to gather or assemble is also found in the First Amendment. So 2 of those freedoms right there were barred from us. COVID-19 and unprecedented restrictions on religious exercise. I believe, this is Elder Bednar, I believe it is vital for us to recognize that the sweeping governmental restrictions that were placed on religious gatherings at the outset of the COVID-19 crisis truly were extraordinary. In what seemed like an instant, most Western governments and many others simply banned communal worship. These restrictions eliminated celebrations of Easter, Passover, Ramadan, and other holy days around the world. No other event in our lifetime, and perhaps no other event since the founding of this nation, has caused quite this kind of widespread disruption of religious gatherings and worship. The COVID-19 restrictions affected the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in a unique way. The Church's April 2020 General Conference, a celebration of the bicentennial of the first vision of the prophet Joseph Smith, had to be broadcast to a global audience from a small auditorium, etc., etc. Clearly, governments have an affirmative duty to protect public health and safety, and I believe public officials have most often sought to do the right thing to protect the public from the virus. Drawing proper lines to protect both the public health and religious exercise in a pandemic is very challenging. I think they went too far. I beg to differ with Elder Bednar. But we cannot deny, and we should not forget, the speed and intensity with which government power was used to shut down fundamental aspects of religious exercise. In other words, they did not pause and think about this. They just shut it down. These decisions and regulations were unprecedented. For nearly 2 months, Americans and many others throughout the free world learned firsthand what it means for government to directly prohibit the free exercise of religion. And for some of you that debated me with it on Facebook, I stand with Elder Bednar. They prohibited our free exercise of religion. Then he talked about how fragile the nature of free religion is. Government powers can never be unlimited. In our political system, the government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. To quote the Declaration of Independence, but the just powers of government cannot be unlimited because they exist most fundamentally to secure the God-given rights of life and liberty so that each of us can exercise our moral agency, the ability to act for ourselves and not to be acted upon, and to be accountable before God for our choices and actions. Constitutions, representative government, checks and balances, and the rule of law help constrain the tendency of government to exercise unlimited power. Of course, liberty has limits. Government has a just role in fostering a moral environment in which people can live in good and honorable lives. But whatever else government officials may be called upon to do, we, the people, must never allow them to forget their offices and powers exist to secure our fundamental freedoms and the conditions for exercising those freedoms. Thus, despite the obvious need for a proper response to COVID-19, we must not become accustomed to sweeping assertions of governmental power. Invoking emergency powers, government executives summarily impose numerous orders and directives that in many ways are analogous to martial law. These executive orders are unlike laws enacted through the ordinary give and take of the democratic process. So this is one of the problems with enacting orders. The legislature should be enacting these because they take their time. Everyone's represented. Everyone has a say. We can reach out to our legislators and say, no, we don't want that, or yes, we do want it, and they have to debate it. That's why legislation is done that way and not through executive orders. That's one of the big problems. Second reflection, religious freedom is paramount among our fundamental rights. I think I already mentioned that. Third reflection, religious freedom is fragile. Fourth reflection, in a time of crisis, sensitive tools are necessary to balance the demands of religious liberty with the just interests of society. And then I want to skip up to the end here where he is saying what he wants. And I might just read between the lines for you a little bit. What I am saying is that we can no more disregard the valid claims of religious freedom in a time of crisis than we can disregard the valid claims of freedom of speech, freedom of the press. You mean like freedom of speech, like the freedom to protest? Or freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures. Nor should we prioritize secular interests above religious ones. In other words, we shouldn't be putting the right to go shopping or the right to sell things or the right to haircuts or anything else above our religious freedoms. A health crisis should not become an excuse for a religious freedom crisis. I believe we must always remember a key principle. Specifically, religion should not be treated less favorably than analogous secular activities. And you'll find that the Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio just found that out in a federal case. Go look it up. They were just told that they way overstepped. For example, the orders of one state barred Catholic priests from anointing a parishioner with holy oil in the performance of last rites, even if the person was not sick with COVID-19, even if the priest and parishioner were protected with masks and gloves, and even if the oil was applied with a swab. In the same state, my church could not perform baptisms even under the safest of conditions. I'm going to harbor a guess that this New York he's talking about. Protecting a person's physical health from the coronavirus is, of course, important, but so is a person's spiritual health. That same state allowed lawyers to meet with people to administer their legal needs, allowed doctors to meet with people to administer their health needs, and allowed caregivers to administer food to satisfy nutritional needs. But it did not allow a clergy person to administer to a person's religious needs, even when the risk of all these activities was essentially the same. This example and many more like it illustrate a profound devaluing of religion. We can and must do better. I also believe we must always remember a second essential principle, namely, policymakers, even in a crisis, should limit the exercise of religion only when it is truly necessary to preserve public health and safety. When the needs of society are great, officials should still ask whether there is some way of addressing these needs other than by burdening or banning the exercise of religion. In other words, it must be narrowly tailored. These lockdowns were not narrowly tailored. Go see my episode on why these lockdowns were unconstitutional. With goodwill and a little creativity, ways can almost always be found to fulfill both society's needs and the imperative to protect religious freedom. After all, the COVID-19 virus is not attracted uniquely to religious people. As most of us now recognize, a variety of methods can be used to mitigate the risk of a virus that do not require outright prohibitions on religious worship or gatherings. The opportunity before us. Here's the call to action, people. The COVID-19 crisis has presented us with a unique opportunity to reaffirm and shore up religious freedom. We have witnessed the government's swift, well-intentioned, but often dangerous breaching of the boundaries that protect the free exercise of religion. I'm not even going to say that it was well-intentioned, but okay. Do we hear the buzzer on the alarm clock? This is a wake-up call for all of us. Those fundamental boundaries and protections must be healed, renewed, and fortified, while believers and the religious organizations must be good citizens in a time of crisis. Never again can we allow government officials to treat the exercise of religion as simply non-essential. Never again must the fundamental right to worship God be trivialized below the ability to buy gasoline. Conclusion. In the midst of crisis, the prodigal son in the biblical parable came to himself and began the long journey back to his home. No doubt in that moment he realized the error of his ways, but more fundamentally, I think he also realized that he had forgotten who he was. There among the swine he remembered, and then everything changed. In our understandable debate to combat COVID-19, we too as a society may have forgotten something about who we are and what is most precious. Perhaps we have not fully remembered that faith and the right to exercise it are central to our identity as believers and to all that we deem good and right and worthy of protection. Now is the time for us to heed the wake-up call, to remember and to act, that we may do so is my hope and my earnest prayer. Remember and to act, people. The First Amendment was trampled on during these months, and we see people now trampling on and taking down our statues. We cannot shun the fight right now. We cannot be afraid. We cannot be afraid of people who are telling us to shut up. We cannot be afraid of people who want to lock down again. We cannot be afraid to not speak our truth. But mostly we need to remember the importance of religious freedom in our lives so that the next time it's threatened, we will stand up. So I'm saying you do what you feel is right, but you could at least start with emailing your governor and telling them this was not right. Tell them to open the churches now, wide open, no restrictions. This is essential. These are our essential First Amendment liberties. Look at who's running for office. Find out what their stance is on this. Where do they stand on this lockdown? Look at people like Kristi Noem in South Dakota. Awesome, awesome governor. She's what we want. She understood. She did not lock people down. Share stories on Facebook. Share your testimony. Share your belief that and your knowledge that this is the most important freedom. Let's not let this happen to us again, people. Let's remember what our founders established for us, and let's be willing to go forward in faith and courage, remembering where we come from, who we come from, and what is most important to us. And this I say in Jesus' name, amen. And thank you for listening to Annette on Life, Liberty, and Happiness. Happy Independence Day. Go find me on YouTube and Facebook, AnnetteTalks.com, yada, yada, yada.